Let's talk about 20th century women. Mike Mill's third feature is one that got a lot of buzz and acclaim for its sharp acting and humorously poignant, reflective screenplay. But what put the film above and beyond for me, and turned it into a unique foray into narrative storytelling, comes from another aspect of the filmmaking: the presentation. More specifically, I was really wowed by how the film makes full metacognitive use of its medium, using everything from narration to stock footage to tell the full breadth of its story beyond its central events taking place in 1979, sometimes intentionally displacing itself narratively and spanning far back or far beyond to give the viewer more context, more dimension to the story being told. And after my first viewing of the film, after taking in this atypical presentation and narrative framework in all its splendor, a thought occurred to me. Is 20th Century Women a narrative visual essay? Let's back up for a second. Maybe the best way to start is to define what a visual essay even is. Though you've probably seen the term describing the kinds of videos like this one, ones that examine film through recutting footage and adding voiceover, the term, in a general sense, can apply to anything that uses digital technologies for carrying out and presenting film and moving image research. As In Transition from Media Commons puts it, the full range of digital technologies now enables film and media scholars to write using the very materials that constitute their objects of study, moving images and sounds. I'm fully aware that my viewing of 20th Century Women as a visual essay is stretching the definition of the term, to say the least. For one thing, John Breslin, one of the supposed creators of the term as far as my research goes, brings up an anticipated distinction between what qualifies as a film and what qualifies as an essay, saying, "Film is visual, the essay is not. Film is collaborative, the essay is not. Film requires big money, the essay costs little and makes less." But after saying that, he concedes it's a distinction subject to change, noting how the accessibility of video editing software has broken down that binary he describes, allowing the sort of genre blending he felt necessitated the origin of the term video essay in the first place. Sort of like how the definitions of words themselves changed given new, frequent colloquial usages, or how eventually some musicians will take a shot at blending two seemingly disparate genres or styles. But why did I settle on narrative visual essay as my term for this movie? Well, for one thing, it is a fictionalized account of Mill's own life, with characters and arcs and plot threads and constructed scenes made to recreate his own relationship with his mother. But the film doesn't feature much of a major plot to speak of, most of it able to be summarized by a one-sentence logline. So then why not go with another term, like visual collage, or autobiographical fiction, as my partner said it reminded them of? Well, for me, it comes down to the style of the film, dramatized with little mini-arcs, but no huge overarching main arc the way typical three-act structures work. Everything in the film works in service of the characters and their interactions, rather than bending to the will of the plot around them. By the end, nothing about the characters or their circumstances is completely resolved. Rather than end on a moment of plot resolution, the film ends once we have a firm, final sense of these characters as complete people. And then there's other stylistic decisions that strike me as more essayistic. The use of stock photos or historical footage or public domain media. The editing style, which often uses time lapses with voiceover from the characters. There's even moments where the film cites its sources mid-scene, the same way you would in an essay, like this. This use of Koyaanisqatsi is basically used the same way you'd see it used in certain video essays about film, not necessarily actively talked about as it's shown, but used as non-diegetic supplementation to what's being discussed thematically. Though not overtly explained as such, the clips from Koyaanisqatsi act as an implicit visual shorthand for the accompanying narration's focus on sweeping societal change. But I think what it comes down to for me is the placement of these sequences that resemble the composition of visual essays within the film. These voiceover moments often come as overviews for the time period, or the character's place and social role.
He grew up with a meaningless war, with protests, with Nixon.
Or a particular subject that commands these characters' obsessions.
I was so cocky, and I was so angry, and I was so happy.
These voiceover sequences come every so often, providing character intros or even an overview of the film as a whole, but I want to single out a few that I think fit the visual essay style best. Perhaps the most diegetic of these is when Elle Fanning's Julie talks about what she enjoys about sex, the people she does it with, and why she partakes in a lifestyle of casual sex.
Because you don't exactly know what they're going to look like, or smell, or feel like, until you do it.
Here, everything in these cutaways and archival photos relates to what Julie is talking about in this scene. They're not direct corollaries to the lines of dialogue they're paired with, but act as visual cues to get to the core of what she's describing, allowing the audience to see the imagistic reference that help us better understand this character and what matters to her.
Then why do you do it?
Because half the time I don't regret it.
But where the movie uniquely complicates things to be more along the lines of a visual essay is a moment like this. There's nothing explicitly connecting the base text of the scene to the archival photos shown, especially given that the scene itself is free of dialogue. Instead, the film uses the flow of these shots to create a Kuleshov effect, meaning, by placing these stills of famous figures in the nascent punk movement against shots of Jamie at a punk show in LA, the editing suggests that Jamie is actively inserting himself into this snapshot of time, living as a part of this legacy of punk. All this comes across without the film explicitly telling us, because the placement of these outside images augments the fictional story being told. Even further removed from the film's means of contextualizing ongoing events and characterizations is its use of biographical overviews for each of the main characters. Essentially, as Jamie learns more of each character's backstory, he narrates their personal history over a montage of that person's life up to that point.
My mom was born in 1924. When she was my age, people drove in sad cars to sad houses, with old phones, no money or food or televisions. But the people were real.
For instance, the film begins with one of these for Dorothea, which coheres with the fact that Jamie starts the film knowing her best because she's his mother. And as he learns more about the other people in his life, these overviews via montage bring us a new layer deeper in understanding each character at the center of the film.
I figured out how to be looked at by men and how to make them excited.
In the case of Dorothea's introduction and that of Tenant William, these segments are accompanied with archival footage and photography capturing the history these characters came from, giving us a snapshot of what sorts of eras they lived through that the younger characters in the film can never completely grasp. This particular method is more akin to cinema verite documentary than any kind of traditional fictionalized narrative, more concerned with offering a true-to-form depiction of lives driven by these pasts than what these details mean for any kind of plot payoff. That's not to say that there aren't those kinds of setups and payoffs at all, but when they do appear, they feel all the more natural for the fact that the film's characters have so much life spilling out of them, the movie they exist in having shirked the usual templates for contrived narrative catharsis. Given the film's period piece nature and the multiple generations among its main cast, it makes sense that so many of these stylistic detours toward the essayistic would be historical, or cultural, or anthropological in approach. But where they all weave together is in one late example of this visual essay style that I think the movie absolutely nails.
It is a crisis of confidence.
Here, Mills juxtaposes Carter's speech about consumerism and meaning-making with sped-up footage of the characters going about their mundane tasks and jobs. And this is where that Koyanis Kwatsi footage I mentioned earlier becomes relevant. By placing it right before this montage of his characters, Mills implies that his characters find themselves in a similar flow in moving through their own lives, and uses this detour from any kind of ongoing action as a way for us to reflect on how these characters make their own meanings for their lives. It acts as both a complication for what we've seen for the past hour and a half, and an omen of the ephemerality of what these characters are living through. For a film like this, so fully immersed in the feel of a specific year, right on the cusp of a new decade, and the larger cultural and political sea change that comes with it, to include something like this is to suddenly widen the film's scope and see the larger realm within which these people occupy. They don't merely live in a bubble. There is a past that each character carries, and a future much more different than any of them expect, looming closer than they realize. But an essay naturally needs a why, and this comes back to what I said about the film not having too much of a notable plot. Without a strict plot in the same vein as most narrative films, 20th Century Women finds its most striking moment of meaning-making, of reflection as a way to make sense of where one's time in life is heading, in this one standout sequence, right about halfway into the film. Annette Bening's Dorothea watches a punk show she goes along to, observes,
It's 1979, I'm 55 years old, and in 1999 I will die of cancer from the smoking.
and then she begins a voiceover talking about her death, and the death of punk, and the coming rise of neoliberalism.
They don't know this is the end of punk. They don't know that Reagan's coming.
This does a bunch of things all at once, so let's break it down piece by piece. To jump off what we just covered in how the crisis of confidence sequence tackles these ideas later in the film, Dorothea's sudden direct break from the temporal present of the ongoing action of the film is meant to shake us, for one big reason. For the first time in the film, she's speaking from an impossibly far-off future, a place of omniscience beyond what she is capable of knowing while living. But she is able to tell us, the viewers, and herself what none of the people in this moment are capable of knowing. None of them truly know what is yet to come, how much things will drastically change for people like them and their subversive underground subcultures. And then there's the personal angle to it, the blunt, cutting directness of what Dorothea is saying. She will die. This life of hers, this moment in which she is living, is not forever. And the array of images that accompany her words, marking all the changes the people around her are not yet aware of, signal the many things that will die or radically shift before her own demise.
It's impossible to imagine HIV. What will happen with skateboard tricks? The internet.
Even at the end of the film, where each character narrates their future, Dorothea is the only character to comment directly on what her death is like.
In March of 1999, I'll start to feel tired and confused. When I finally go to the doctor, he will say that the cancer in my lungs had already traveled to my breast and brain.
By choosing to make Dorothea the one to deliver this monologue, to have this realization, Mills seems to be indicating that it's Dorothea's own history and knowledge of prior change that allows her to be the one to deliver this monologue. She knows how the past has changed more than any other character in the film, and therefore it makes sense that she knows better than anyone else how much more change will happen while she is alive. There's a curious symmetry to the presentation of essayistic moments throughout the film at play here as well. Dorothea, more than anyone else, has these montages and historical images paired with her narration. This continues that trend of depicting how much history and time she takes in, the means by which much of this movie allows us to parse how these present moments we are witnessing feed off the past and feed into the decades to come.
I died before the new year. Dolphin-shaped balloons floated over my head. They were playing Louis Armstrong on a boombox.
And with that, Mills places the entire film in perspective, while there's still half of it to go. This won't last. None of it will. Not the lives of the people, not the culture they exist in, not the things they enjoy and consume. No matter how much it means to them, it won't last. It can't last with the ways things change around them. And that, in turn, affects how we view the rest of the film, how we feel the impending finality of what the characters are living through. Though we've gotten accustomed to the stasis of the first half of the film and the era it places us in, it, like all things, must change. A new meaning is made. Just as the three central women of different ages and personalities in the film make new their own individual meanings of womanhood with their differences in backgrounds, so too do new eras of history and culture. There must be that change, and a traditional narrative format wouldn't accommodate that theme of change in quite the same way. There's something I brought up earlier about an essay needing to have a why, a meaning, that's been lingering in my head as I wrote those previous passages. See, I've made a handful of video essays before talking about the craft of film and the generic implications at play, but here, more than ever before, I feel a need to ask, why am I making this video? What meaning am I trying to grasp at here? Is it just a way for me to use a film I love to explain formalist technique? Or is there something deeper at play here? I mean, what does it mean, personally, to me, to have such a strong urge to write about this particular movie with this particular focus? As I move to a conclusion for this video, I want to leave aside the central question I started this video with, the question of whether this movie fits within the boundaries of a nebulous, relatively new term within media criticism. This particular video has been something I've been wanting to make since the film came out, and it's been in development for roughly 3 years now as I've struggled with prolonged video making burnout and the internal pressure to feel like I needed to do this movie the justice it deserves. And I couldn't come up with a conclusion, strictly working within the place where I had started drafting this video 3 years ago. To write about 20th century women is to meet it on its own terms, to move away from the impulse to be formalistic, from looking at it from a removed distance, and digging deeper than just a purely analytical approach. And talking only about the ways in which its form is accomplished or organized doesn't take into account the significant emotional impact of that presentation, the compounding pathos and empathy it imparts on a viewer. I mean, of what worth is it to talk about the ways a movie does a thing if you don't talk about what that thing ultimately means? And so, I got to thinking, what does 20th century women's format mean to me? What about its style and loose structuring has made me latch onto it the way I have? What about it made me take special note about what the film is doing formalistically? And then, it started to dawn on me. As I've gone about the most recent stage of drafting this video, having not worked on this draft since late 2018, I wondered, was my delay in making this video from me not knowing what to say? Or was it because I didn't have the words to express it yet? In the time since I started drafting this video essay in 2017, I came to terms with being transgender, begun transitioning, and worked through my own way of making sense of what it means to be a woman. There were struggles and challenges, as there are for many who forge the same path to being happy with who they are, but I learned more about myself than ever in those moments of questioning and gradual understanding. And with that, my ways of making sense of the media I consumed became less technical, less removed, and I started consciously recognizing my emotional attachments to the films I loved, how much more they began resonating with me. My writing started becoming less anonymous, less rigid, as I moved away from the purely functional and began incorporating whatever personal slants made sense for each project I worked on. And every time I returned to 20th Century Women and was confronted with the nakedly honest ways it depicts these three very different women, the more I would see myself in them, and the more I would see myself in new, different ways. I see all facets of myself in it. The punk girl, the sexually liberated girl, the internal pastel goth heavily into no wave, the girl who enjoys her quiet retreats to herself at home with only her cat for company, the girl who escapes to the throes of a mosh pit as her means of release, the girl who passionately voices her frustrations only after being pushed to a point where she can't contain herself any longer. I saw that my womanhood was multifarious, that there was no single, easy way to describe it or pin it down. That's what 20th Century Women's multifaceted approach allows, what its extended dives into its disparate women's lives elucidates, where another film might leave these people inscrutable, impenetrable, only seen from the outside. That's what makes the film's ending montage, where each character gets the chance to speak to their own future, especially bittersweet. It tells us that the varied, overlapping experiences of these people is fleeting before they ultimately drift apart, but its focus on the time before that drifting leaves us knowing that, for a brief span, these very different people had coalesced and coexisted and left the lasting impact on each other that they did. The way meaningful women linger in the minds of the women they meet years after the fact. The way the meaningful women I knew years ago, or met in passing, still burn bright in my memories. The ways I find myself still making myself after them. In seeing how Mike Mills presents the women in 20th Century Women, and how much complexity and richness his approach to the film allows them, I saw how I had been making sense of my own femininity since I saw the film in its theatrical release, how I had been making sense of what kind of woman I was, much in the same way Mills constructs these intricately detailed portraits of these women. The unique way he presents these women's lives had unconsciously been a presence in my mind for years, always present as I gained a firmer, clearer sense of my own gender. Like many who only gain that kind of certainty about their gender once they're able to fully, properly embrace it, my understanding of my own womanhood became more and more complete over time the more I pushed myself to live my happiest life. And the more I gained that complete, nuanced portrait of my femininity, the more I found myself reflected in these otherwise uncharacteristic narrative presentations of womanhood. The more I connected with my gender, the more I found myself embracing the many ways the film acted as a mirror for all the parts of myself I hadn't yet recognized. To return briefly to the question I introduced at the beginning of this essay, is 20th Century Women a narrative visual essay? Well, to quote the film itself, yes and no. But rather than split hairs over the formal distinction that can be applied to this movie, I want to leave that question open-ended as something for you and me to reflect on. What does a film's formalistic approach ultimately say about the kind of emotional effect it tries to evoke in its viewers? What does that conscious departure from the stylistic norm change in its overall effect? How does that affect a viewer's attachment to the film, or their ability to latch onto the material? No matter what 20th Century Women can truly be classified as, I know one thing for certain. I see myself in it more than I've ever seen myself in any other film. I've learned more about myself from it than I have from any other film. And I think that's a pretty strong endorsement for what it does.